Well, welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Today, we have a truly exceptional guest once again joining us, Rich Horwath. Rich is the founder and CEO of the Strategic Thinking Institute, a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA best-selling author. In this episode with Rich, we unpack why so many leaders struggle to focus strategically and share proven tools to overcome those challenges. We'll explore exercises like target practice, which helps leaders zero in on their core priorities, and we will show you how to make critical trade-offs that drive success. Rich also discusses how to leverage competition and differentiation to build a sustainable competitive advantage in today's fast-paced business environment. So if you've ever felt stuck with tactical tasks or overwhelmed by competing priorities, this conversation will provide you the clarity and the tools you need to think strategically and lead effectively. So let's get started. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Another reason why a lot of leaders fail is the failure to focus. They just focus on too many things. We are really met with an overabundance of opportunities to focus on in today's society. And one of the exercises you give, I love it, if you could just unpack it more for our listeners, is to gain clarity on the core things that you should be focusing on. Consider the exercise that you refer to as target practice.
Yeah, exactly. And again, we can make it really complex, but I like to keep things simple. And so as I think about, if we think about a target with rings, right? Let's say we're throwing an axe or we're shooting an arrow. We've got different rings, or we're throwing a dart. The target simply means let's get back to where our core focus should be. So we need to think about, who do we serve the best? Who do we bring the most value to? That's going to be an important part. Where do we, as we talked about earlier, where do we deserve to win? Where do our core competencies, our capabilities? So again, core competencies, where are you expert that other people in your industry aren't expert at? Capabilities, what are the skill sets and resources that you have that other competitors don't have? And then when you think about different target audiences, how can you use those core competencies and those capabilities to focus and bring greater value to those targets? So again, as you mentioned, we can make it more complex, but I would challenge all of the folks out there, just draw the target on your piece of paper and think about who you're currently serving today. So list out either categorically, segment, who are your different customers, and then in the middle, put where you bring the greatest amount of value, and then see if you've got people that are way on the outside, and think about, should we be focused on serving those people on the perimeter, or should we bring our offerings and things more in line with the people that are at the center of that target?
Excellent exercise, really, to help provide that focus that many leaders need. The other thing that I find always with strategy is the inability of individuals to make trade-offs. And if you don't want to make a trade-off, it's really not a strategy. There's always trade-offs inherent in any strategy, and you need to have those if you are going to consider yourself a strategic leader that develops sound strategy.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I've found really is the separator between good leaders and great leaders, is that ability and the willingness to make trade-offs. Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, has done an amazing job, obviously, over the years growing that organization. And he said, if you're not genuinely pained by the risk involved in your strategic choices, then it's not much of a strategy. And what he means by that is we can't try and be all things to all people. We really do have to say, where are we going to focus on? Which opportunities? When I hear people say, well, we don't have a strategy, but we're opportunistic. To me, that means you're not making trade-offs. Every shiny object that comes flying by is something that we're going to actually invest time doing. And the reality is we all have limited resources, time and talent and budget. So we've got to really focus on where are we gonna focus. And so the thing I would recommend to people is think about trade-offs like a plate. If you're at Thanksgiving dinner or a holiday dinner and you add things to your plate, at some point the plate becomes full, right? You can't add anything else without taking something off by pulling it off or by eating it. And so the reality is we can't keep in business, we can't keep adding things to our plate without taking things off. So, as a leader with your team, you've got to ask yourself, what are the trade offs we need to make? And a simple exercise, Charles, I'd recommend for folks listening out there is, draw four boxes. In the top left box, put eliminate, the bottom left, put decrease, the top right, put increase, and the bottom right, put create. Then think about where you and your team are spending your time and your resources, and then ask yourself in that upper left box, what should we eliminate? What's a trade off we're willing to make because this activity, this resource area is no longer adding value? So, what are we going to eliminate? That's a powerful exercise. And my guess is your team, having facilitated this exercise, your team will definitely have ideas on what you should stop doing in order to make good trade offs.
It's a great exercise. It reminds me of a company that makes the trade-offs very explicit on their website, and that's Vikings Cruise Line. And they tell you what they're not. They're not the drinking man's cruise. They're the thinking man's cruise. They don't want kids or families on the cruise. And they identify very clearly, here's our trade-offs. And as a result, they're very effective in a very competitive market space as a result of making that delineation very clear to not only internal people, but also to the public as well.
Yeah, Charles, that's an excellent example that you bring up. And it really shows the discipline that the leaders there have because obviously they could serve families, they could serve kids, they could have the booze cruise type of approach, but they don't do it. Like you said, they're very explicit in what they don't do. And if we think about our favorite brands, typically we see that level of discipline, whether it's an Apple or it's an Airbnb or whoever it may be, they do certain things, they do them extremely well, and I think Viking's a great example that you bring up.
Well, let's shift gears to competitive advantage and looking at some of the key steps to create it and sustain it. And one of the things that always is brought to my mind is that many times managers define competition too narrowly. Yet competition for profits goes beyond the established industry rivals to include competitive forces, customers, suppliers, potential entrants, and substitutes. That's one issue. The other issue is really they don't understand the responses their competitors are going to give to their strategy enough. They don't think through that far enough to really identify what's going to create that competitive advantage in a sustainable manner.
Yes, that's exactly right, and one of the things, especially these days, is I always ask people, "Who's your most dangerous competitor?" And they typically will say that, the person the group they've been tussling with for years and years and years, and I'll say, "Okay, let's put them aside now. Talk to me about who else could use the services, the products in your industry in different ways." So let's get into the non-traditional competitors that are competing for the wallets or the mind share or the time of the people that you're serving. And when we start to look at it through that lens, then the light bulbs start to go off and say, wow, I didn't really think about that. We've been so ingrained in this, Coke versus Pepsi, United versus American Airlines battle with our traditional competitor that we weren't really opening our eyes to other types of competitors. And again, another exercise that I lead teams through oftentimes is, let's blank slate it from competitor standpoint. So if you are a new competitor entering this market, how would you position yourself? And typically, what I like to do is come up with about five or six key decision points. So, what are the value factors for a customer to choose one product or another in this industry? So, it might be price, convenience, speed, quality. And now, if you were a new competitor with no baggage or no history, how would you come up with a product or service in order to be successful in this industry? And so again, it gives people the ideas that look, who we competed with in the past may not be who we're competing with against in the future.
And you provide a couple of steps on how to emerge with a competitive advantage. One is customers perceive a consistent difference between offerings, and that differentiation occurs in an attribute that impacts the buying decision. That's one. Two is the difference in the offering stems from a distinctive capability or unique activities that your business has. And then the final one is both the offering difference and the distinctive capability activities, they can last over time.
Yeah. It's important to think about competitive advantage, not just in the products themselves or the services themselves. That's, I think, where a lot of people run awry. The competitor comes out, so, Apple comes out with a new iPhone, it's got a 3D camera and all this stuff, and now the others, Samsung and the other competitors say, "Well, we've gotta match those product features." But the reality is that's not the way to be successful in the long run. Instead of matching what other folks are doing, we wanna step couple steps back and think about what are the capabilities, the skill sets, the activities that can help differentiate us. So instead of just focusing on product, let's think about some of the other important characteristics. Might be the customer's experience, customer education, customer support, customer learning. So there's other areas in addition to product and service features that can play a very prominent role in helping an organization be successful. So that would be the thing to really think about is don't just think about your product offerings, but think about the capabilities and the activities around the offerings that could also bring you advantage.
Great example you provide on how a small company can really build market share and become successful in a very competitive space is the company Liquid Death and how they kind of overcame some of the advantages of larger rivals by employing the judo principles. And walk us through that example, give our listeners some insight into kind of what they did and how they differentiated their brand.
Yeah, it's a fun example, and, before writing the book, I didn't know a lot about Liquid Death. I had seen it at a few concerts and honestly didn't even know what it was initially. I thought it might be a new beer or one of the new hard seltzers, but it's actually water, and they took a really unique approach. If you think about most bottled water, you think about this very serene, very healthful, very mindful approach to packaging, to marketing, this healthy lifestyle, and they said, "We're gonna completely go on the other end of the spectrum." So they came up with the name Liquid Death, which is obviously on the other side of, healthful and things like that. They came up with, brand names that were really different and more associated with a haunted house or a terror type of movie, and then they came up with these interesting activities. So one was the, TASE test. So we hear about taste tests a lot. This was the TASE test. So they actually offered people the opportunity to compare Liquid Death water versus some of the other waters. And if people could tell the difference, they would get a prize. But if they couldn't tell the difference, then they would get tased. And they actually they created some videos where they did tase people that had criticized the taste of Liquid Death beforehand, but then couldn't tell the difference because the quality they felt was good enough. So it's just a really good example of what I like to do with an exercise about deviation from the norm. Charles, if we think about excellence, excellence is defined as deviation from the norm. And so if we're doing the same normal things in the same normal ways, we're not going to be successful. And Liquid Death took that approach. They said, look, if we come out with another healthful, mountainy, beautiful landscape approach to marketing this product, it's not going to work. So they said, we're going to go on the opposite end. So they deviated from the norm. So I would ask everybody out there, take a piece of paper, draw two columns. One column is the norm. So, what typically happens in your industry? So, think about marketing, sales, operations, IT, finance. What's the norm? So, think about all those norms. Then, in the right column, put deviation. And then think about how could we deviate from the norm in some of these areas. And if you look at Liquid Death, they did a great job of deviating from that norm column.
Great story with that. And really, the failure to differentiate is often due to the propensity of for operational effectiveness. And the majority of companies in nearly all industries you mentioned as well, and I agree with you, are constantly fighting battles of operational effectiveness, which is trying to do the same activities in the same tactical ways as other, just doing them better and faster, right?
Yeah, Charles, that's exactly right. And it goes back to what Michael Porter said earlier, that 9 out of 10 companies didn't really have a strategy. And it's because, to your point, they're confusing it with operational effectiveness. So I think about operational effectiveness. We're running the same race on the same course as our competitor. Strategy is saying, look, we're going to run a different course. We're going off road. We're going to run this different path because this is the way that we're going to be successful. So, again, anything that's strategic has to have some element of differentiation, either doing the same activity in different ways or doing completely different activities than the competition. It's difficult to do. And in fact, research shows 80% of people find that thinking differently about the business is very taxing. It's hard to do. They can't do it. But the reality is, if we're going to succeed in the long run, we've got to identify what's unique about us and then really package and communicate that differentiation to separate ourselves from people who are just performing around operational effectiveness.
And I love the way you simplify things. And I love this change in kind of a paradigm shift in the question that you ask. Because the key challenge then is to shift your mindset from a focus on how are we better, which everyone tends to think still, and a lot of people reside in that camp, to how are we different in ways customers value.
Yeah, exactly. And again, the thing I keep coming back to just logically is that when we think better, it's always going to be subjective because we don't necessarily know exactly what the person thinking about our product or service is considering as their main factor that's going to sway them to use our product or a customer's or a competitor's. So we've got to really think about not just what's better because that's subjective, but how are we different? An example I use is blueberry pie better than banana cream pie? Well, Charles, you might like one and I might like the other. And so, there's no right or wrong there. But if we say, look, blueberry pie is different than banana cream because it has blueberries, which have antioxidants, they're good for you. They may help prevent cancer. So that's the differentiator that if I'm focused on blueberry pie, I'm going to use. I can't just say, well, blueberry pie is better because it tastes better. That's subjective. That's not going to go anywhere. And again, it's a simple example, but there's lots of companies out there that are struggling today because they're focused on being better instead of different.
I wanted during our conversation as well to focus on some great leadership skills as well and not make the focus just solely on strategy. And in part of your book, you talk about various leadership skills. There's a few that I wanted to kind of bring to the attention of our listeners, which I think are underserved. So you mentioned in medicine, you wouldn't prescribe something without a diagnosis, which equals malpractice, right? But we'd never accept that remedy without a thorough examination or a medical condition that's warranted. But in business, we commit this sin all the time. We're constantly prescribing new activities, strategies, and tactics without first diagnosing our business condition. And that situational awareness is so underappreciated and underdeveloped in many leaders.
That's absolutely true. And if we go back to our friend Sun Tzu, the Chinese Zen philosopher, I mean, he realized this, thousands of years ago. He said, "Do not repeat the same tactic which has given you one victory, but instead model your tactics and strategies after the infinite variety of circumstances that you're facing." And so, even that far back, he talked about you can't just keep repeating the same thing over and over again, right? I mean, that's Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. But that's what a lot of folks are doing. So, situational awareness really it means how are we looking at what's happening around us and really assessing what's changing in our environment. And I'm a big believer that on a monthly, quarterly basis, we need to sit down with our team and ask what's changing inherently in the market. And does that affect what we're looking to do? Because people will always tell you there's lots of things changing. But, as Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, said, if the rate of change inside a company is slower than the rate of change outside, then the end is in sight. The only question is when. And I think he hit on something important there. If you're not matching your responsiveness and evolution of your business to the evolution of the external marketplace, then you're going to become obsolete like a Circuit City or a Blockbuster Video.
And like we mentioned before in our conversation, how often have you seen a business following a strategy that worked in the past but has no chance of working now because the context is different? So you got to think, plan, and act strategically requires you to have that continual awareness of both the internal and external environments. And you have a great technique and a tool, the contextual radar, that can really provide you with that visual snapshot of those key areas in four primary areas: the market, customers, competitors, and the company.
Yeah, Charles, and again, you bring up some great points there, and I like the contextual radar because it's really simple, right? I mean, if you're listening out there, you could draw the circle on a sheet, You can draw a line straight down the middle and then a line across. You've got 4 areas now like a radar screen. You put market in the upper right, you put customers in the lower right, you put competitors in the lower left, and then company in the upper left. So you got market, customers, competitors, company. Now just sit down and ask yourself, what's happening? What are the key things? What's top of mind for me in each of those areas? And start jotting those down. Then what's really interesting, in your next team meeting, have everybody sit in silence, do this activity for 5 minutes, then share what everyone had. And I guarantee you'll get some new learnings because everybody has slightly different perspectives on the business. Then take it even a step further. If you work with customers, bring this to your customers, sit down with them either verbally or visually, get their perspective. What are they seeing as far as the market changes? What are they seeing with their customers? What's happening with their competitors? And then what's going on within their company? So, to your point, Charles, the contextual radar can be a really interesting tool to use to gauge our situation, as you talk about, to take that snapshot of what's going on. And if we start to do that monthly or even quarterly, and then put those images next to one another, now we can really see what's changing in the business before other people do.
It's a great exercise to do. You can even do it prior to a SWOT analysis, right? So, because it generates thinking and conversations around those 4 areas covered in that SWOT analysis, but to make sure also to update that radar on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, with the radar, with your strategic plan, and again, I'd recommend your strategic plan be no more than 2 pages. I know that might be shocking for some people, but what I've seen is if you've got a 30 or 40 slide PowerPoint deck that's your plan, or you've got an Excel spreadsheet with 10 different tabs that's your plan, the reality is we're not updating those things because they're too big. So I recommend a strategy print, which is a 2 page blueprint. There's lots of tools out there that you can find, but find 1 or 2 pages where you can capture your insights and learnings on one page, and then you've got your ghost framework, your action plan on that second page. Because to your point, Charles, we've got to be able to, on a regular basis, update what's happening in our situation and then potentially update what's happening in our plan.
And with great leaders have a few attributes that many people can follow, and they're not that difficult, but common sense isn't common practice. And I always like to say that the separation comes from the preparation. Your level of performance and results are directly proportional to the amount that you prepare. You want better results? Increase your preparation. Kind of the years of experience, people say, but I have all this years of experience. You mentioned a very great study in the book that neurosurgeons who have been operating for 15 years are typically no more skilled than their peers who have been operating for just a few years, unless they've increased their preparation through deliberate practice.
Yeah, it's funny, Charles. I'm glad you brought that study up because there's other studies too that have replicated that in other areas in medicine and outside of medicine. And this thing that we're so busy, everyone's on our we're on our activity treadmills, going and going and going. And the reality is we've got to stop and really reflect on what are we doing, why are we doing it, how could we do it better. Preparation is so important. I'm always amazed at how little preparation people have for the meetings they attend. I'm a big believer that if you've got an hour-long meeting, your preparation should be 30 to 60 minutes for that meeting. Now, I know there's people probably falling out of their chairs saying, I've got 6 meetings a day and I don't have 6 hours to prepare for that. But what that tells me is you have too many meetings. I'm a big believer that on a regular basis, at least 2 to 4 times a year, you should be doing a meeting audit. You should identify what are all the meetings I'm currently leading or attending. What's the purpose of those meetings? What's the cadence of those meetings? So how many days a month or week? What's the time frame? And then what's the value from 0 to 3? 0 is no value, 3 is high value. And so if you go through that meeting audit, and I do this with executives that I coach, there's always meetings that people say, look, we can cross this off. I got to stop going to this. I'm going to send one of my direct reports, or we're going to take this meeting. Bob Iger, who's back at Disney as the CEO, he's famous for saying, look, if you want a 60-minute meeting, it's 30 minutes. If you want a 30-minute meeting, it's 15 minutes. If you want a 10-minute meeting, it's 5 minutes. He said he's always found that if you cut meeting time in half, people will get to the point more quickly and you'll resolve the issues in a much more expedient way. So I'm a big believer that preparations is really important across the board and especially for meetings.
You have great insight, and a great rule of thumb is that the activities and tasks that you're investing the most time in each day should also be the ones you're investing the most time preparing for beforehand. Because many executives, many leaders, they arrive at their desk in the morning and they don't have a plan for the day. They haven't allocated chunks of time to their most important priorities. So they're acting like, and I love the metaphor you use, they're acting like a bumper car at a carnival, bouncing from one thing to the next with no rhyme or reason. So you say, don't be a carny, be strategic. Love
Right.
it.
Not to offend anyone who's worked at a carnival before, but that's the reality is we've gotta have some direction and some discipline to do that.
Another piece of advice that I find that a lot of leaders are saying now that you disagree with is they need to fail fast and fail often. Why does that not produce greater success in the future?
Well, for one thing, the research shows it's absolutely not true. There's some studies I quote in the book around entrepreneurs that have failed in their first business, and then their success rate is actually lower than entrepreneurs that are successful in their first business. And then there's other studies around physicians as well that had surgical procedure errors that they did not necessarily learn from those mistakes. So I think that's overused. I know fail fast really came from the startup world and hey, if something's not working, let's pivot, let's do something else. And that may be okay in that area. But what I see is way too many mature companies and mature leaders are saying, well, we need to fail fast. But the reality is these days, a chief executives, the tenure for a CEO these days is between 2 and 4 years, down from about 5 to 8 years. So the window for performing is getting shorter and shorter. And so you've got less time. So instead of fail fast, I would like to say think first. If we think first and explore the options, then we're going to give ourselves a much better chance to succeed. So again, I think fail fast is overused by people who don't think first.
Absolutely. And in fact, research shows that failure typically leads to poor performance and worse results. So instead, ramp up on your level of preparation. So, the final topic before we end today, I just wanted to kind of give our listeners some more insight into non judgmental observation. And you have a great story about UCLA's legendary coach, John Wooden, that when he was studied during practices, his comments to his players and what the researchers recorded were that only 6.9% were they compliments of the time. 6.6% were expressions of displeasure. The vast majority, 75%, were pure information, simple directions on how to play basketball. Coach Wooden didn't waste time with good or bad. He objectively told players what he wanted them to do and had them immediately do it, which is what leaders should do as well, correct?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, Charles. We waste so much time in our businesses thinking, "Well, this is good. We got this sale," or "This is bad. The customer hasn't called back," or "The client wants to change this, so this is bad." We waste so much time on that subjective assessment when at the end of the day, we don't know if it's going to be good or bad or positive or negative. But the reality is we can always assess and then move on. What's the next thing we need to do? If we're playing tennis or pickleball and we're hitting the ball into the net, we can say, "Oh, that was a terrible shot. I'm a bad player. I don't even know why I got up this morning." Or we can say, "You know what? I hit the ball in the net. Let's take the paddle back a little earlier and put a little bit more topspin on the next shot." What's going to be more helpful? But the reality is, again, it takes discipline to get out of that mindset. I actually, for some of the clients I work with, I send them a judge's gavel with the block, the wooden block beneath it, to put that on their desk. So every once in a while during the day, they look at that and say, am I judging things as good or bad? Or am I assessing them and then providing direction on what to do next, like Coach Wooden would do?
And practicing non judgmental observation doesn't mean that we ignore what's happening. It just means we observe people, situations, processes as they are without categorizing them as positive or negative.
Yeah, that's what really well put. I think that's exactly what we're looking to do. And again, we want to be productive and efficient. Again, people say we don't have enough time, but a lot of the time we spend wasting thinking about, well, we're going to complain about this or this isn't working out the way we wanted it to. No, skip that step of subjectivity and judgment and go right to the assessment as you talk about, Charles, and then what do we do with it?
Great. Well, as we end, always like to give that call to action to our listeners. We talked about a lot during today's episode. Is there one thing you would like for leaders to start doing to become more strategic?
Yeah, the first thing I would ask them to do is think about what could you eliminate? The reality is we always add stuff, and the research shows we always add things when we're trying to solve problems. But I would ask you one thing: what can you eliminate from your schedule, meetings, types of emails, types of reports, types of paperwork, types of interactions? What can you eliminate to give yourself more productive and effective use of your time and your energy? So that'd be one thing: is what can you eliminate?
Well, thank you so much, Rich, for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Well, thanks, Charles. It's been great to be with you today. I've got lots of free resources, white papers, videos, infographics at strategyskills.com. So, strategyskills.com, lots of free resources to help you think and plan strategically.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.